All right, so now we're going to really get into Archaic Greek, really the deep foundation of Greek culture. Some very, very important ideas and some famous Greeks in the classical era, which is kind of the next era of Greece, but they really have links to archaic times. And what happens between the previous lecture and this lecture is another one of those so-called Dark Ages. In this case, it's the Greek Dark Age. It starts around 800. It started to end around 800. And it's not like they woke up one day and they're like, guys, we're in a dark age, right? We got to get out of this. Hooray, yay, right? Dark age here lasts between about 1100 to about 800. And you can really even push that back to about 1200 to 800, somewhere along those lines. And it's not really a clear line in the sand of dark ages or anything like that. You know, we got to have to be kind of very careful with that idea that, you know, dark ages just start and stop. And this is actually the second time of dark ages, and it doesn't mean that, you know, everyone's dead or everything's awful. It doesn't mean there's like the bubonic plague running around or anything like that. It just means that there's some kind of collapse. Then there might be a little bit worse or something than previous eras, and that's usually safe to say, but it just means that during the Dark Ages, we have less historical sources and less writing that takes place. And usually it's because of very, very damaging socioeconomic factors. But that doesn't mean that anything just catastrophic happened. But I think you can understand them by saying that we just don't know a lot from that time period. So then from about 800 to about 490, we get Archaic Greece, which just means old. It's the old time of Greece. And this is clearly a term that's based on the next stage, right? The next batch of Greeks in the classical era. So you have the classical age and the Archaic age. So that's just older. That's the previous stuff. So we're going to start with the development of Greek colonies, and they start to show back up. And one of the things that we see is that there's clear evidence of Dark Ages ending when they start coming out of that and recovering from whatever happened after the Mycenaeans and the late Bronze Age collapse. When they start colonizing. So if you start sending out colonies, you're either desperate because you're either going to all move, or because something bad's happening, or you might colonize because, hey, everything's going better and we're going to increase our wealth. And so there's not this invasion of the whole group of Greeks, moving to the Ionian coast over here, but more that you have small colonies that are really kind of going to become known as the Ionian Greeks. And they live on this orange section on the map over here, and so it's to the west, or it's to the east, and then on modern day Turkey. And if you rewind a couple hundred years, this is where the Hittites were previously at, right? The Hittite kingdom. So centuries ago, and then the Ionians come in, and it's very important for two reasons. One of which we'll talk about in the next section, but that is that they are the ones who begin to start this natural philosophy as a field of thought and inquiry, which is very, very important to their legacy. And the whole big thing on that is in the philosophy lecture, or on the next section. But we want to mention that right now because of this movement, they come into contact with the Phoenicians. And the Ionians then go on and take the Phoenician alphabet and they spread it. And we've seen, even when we were talking about in previous lectures, where the Greeks really create the modern alphabet for the most part. It becomes easier to read and language, and thus Greek language really becomes born. So it's another legacy of the Phoenicians, the Mycenaean history, not having political and military power, but having major cultural impacts. And so the Phoenicians are actually a very big deal. So then we're going to talk about the Ionian Greeks. And again, they're on the coast of Turkey. Now, what what ends up happening next is a little bit harder to kind of tease out, but than writing. But so the writing really kind of grows. They develop this system that's easier to learn, and then all the old languages that had vanished during the Dark Age, we kind of get rid of them. We kind of start doing a completely new way of tracking records and business transactions. And so when that starts, they start writing in a way that kind of Mesopotamia had been writing. It just starts out as tax receipts and business records. But then this new alphabet really comes along, and now they're going to start composing much bigger works like epics and stuff like that. So you end up with Homer. And he talks about the Trojan War. And, you know, if Homer even existed, there's a debate on whether, you know, he actually existed or if that was just kind of somebody that the ancients kind of made up to kind of put a name on it. But he wrote around 800 BC. But the story is set back all the way at 1200 when things started to fall apart. And writing in this language made writing epics possible. You know, you can only advance language in writing as far as the alphabet will allow you to go, as far as your writing system allows you to go. And so when the Greeks have this Greek language that they develop with the alphabet, all of a sudden these long oral traditions start getting written down, even centuries later. And so you might, you know, if you've ever read it or if you have seen part of it, you know, it's kind of like just a telling of a story that ends up getting for hundreds of years, and then it finally gets written down by this person Homer in around 800. It does, though, support the idea of the Trojan War. I'm not an archaeologist, right? But it's very interesting to kind of see, you know, was there a Troy? Was it destroyed around this time? And, you know, was Odysseus a real person? Obviously, the mythology behind that is fiction, but what was it based on? These stories would have gotten embellished, but they had to be based on something. There has to be some historical account. It seems unlikely they would have just made it up. And so to say that they never existed at all seems kind of, you know, difficult to say, but it certainly, the stories reflect a time period that they're written in, which is Archaic Greece. And we know that because, like, in Homer's story, when he writes it down, Achilles is using iron. And so they obviously changed the story when Homer wrote it down from when the story actually would have taken place, because they weren't using iron in 1200 BC, but they were by 800. And so obviously those stories kind of reflect the time that they're written in, but they obviously have some kind of historical background. Now, during Archaic Greece, the most important for us to remember is the development of two really important values, the idea of reciprocity and of virtue. So reciprocity is the notion that you give, you know, there's positive and negative reciprocity. You know, if you burn my house down, you know, I'm going to, you know, we're going to fix it. Like, there's going to be payback to me for you burning my house down. But, you know, if you can't pay me for it, then I'm going to take something back from you in return for that, right? Maybe you don't have a monetary system, but that idea of reciprocity, that for every action there's a reaction, you know, that you owe me for something that I give you or something like that. You know, or the idea of positive is that, like, hey, I do something good for you, and then you take that and you do something good for somebody else. We call it, like, you know, pay it forward today. And it's still an expression that we use. And so we're not going to just store something up, you know, and keep it. We're going to pass that goodwill on. And so if a storm devastates your crop and there's a terrible accident, maybe all your sheep are gone, or there's a disaster, right? Positive reciprocity says, hey, the community will come together because you owe them favors, or because you've done for the community, they're going to come together and do for you. But the negative side of that, if you kill a person, their family's going to take vengeance on you, right? And it's a core element for their, you know, kind of very macho, patriarchal, male-dominated culture. Virtue is going to take a little bit more to explain. Virtue is the idea of excellence, okay? It's a Greek word, arete, and virtue is like righteous living, something like that. And that's only a part of it to the Greeks, right, though? In fact, some people would say that it's not even really part of it, just this idea of righteous living. But Greek virtue is about effectiveness and excellence in public performance, right? So how you perform in battle, how you give a speech, how you perform in athletic competitions, debates, all sorts of things that become very important in these city-states as they grow. especially when kind of the idea of democracy comes up in the Golden Age of Athens, which is, in the next module. But when the Golden Age comes up, you have these public assemblies and discussions and votes and willpower and your ability to persuade and get through the red tape, and that's your virtue. So it's really going to involve things like, fear and shame, right? Like someone that it's devoted to, you better make sure that how you pay them back if somebody gives something to you, and how your name is going to be upheld. That's really a big part of virtue, like who you are and what you do that is good and effective. And that kind of turns back into reciprocity, because if you're a good person and you're a good athlete, you're a good politician, you're a good poet, then people will pay you back for all of those good things that you do. And it's really a foundation to this unique political order that the Greeks develop, which is, again, they have many political innovations, particularly in Athens and during their Golden Age, that are more famous. But this is the historical legacy that builds into that. And so democracy and philosophy, it kind of starts during this time period with these key points. And one of the most important parts of allowing these ideas to kind of develop is the idea of the Greek polis. Okay? In fact, our word politics comes from the Greek word polis, which means city. It's a political unit centered on a city and its surrounding land. And you need to make sure you can kind of work with the world around you, right? And you kind of need to understand this idea of the polis for quiz and test purposes, for like short answer or something, right? But the polis is really the center of Greek life and political theory. There's a lot of different subfields of political development in Greek policy. They have an enormous historical legacy as a result of that. But the polis is at the center of that. So we go from the Archaic into the classical age of Greece, and all of this kind of stays true. You get the ideas of citizenship and what it means to live in a particular city, and what are my rights, because, I'm from Athens. What are my rights compared to a Spartan, and how are they different or better, and how are we going to evaluate this? And it's a giant discourse and dialogue and debate. But citizenship and equality and voting and stuff like this really kind of come up during this time frame. We talked about the Sumerians perhaps having the first assemblies, and then they obviously yield to kings and eventually priests and stuff like that, and you have a mix, right? But the Greek cities are assemblies all the way, and it's basically pure open democracy, and particularly in the mainland, places like Athens. Now, others like Sparta, they have kings, but they still have councils that, and bigger councils, smaller councils, different branches of government. And it really depended on the sphere of society that you were talking about. All of this has its beginnings in Archaic Greece. These grand ideas about government that are much, much more complex than just saying, here's a king and do what he says, right? And so having a king, and that's great. But then when you have these councils, it's kind of like having multiple quarterbacks on the field at the same time, right? And so it really is, it's the ability to have more voices in the room. And so the most important thing, again, is the development of democracy in these city-states during the Archaic Age. And then in the Classical Age, this really becomes a major, major thing. No big city-states tend to share similar institutions, right? Because geography really breaks up Greece, and the city-states tend to have certain things in common, but they organize each place very differently because they are all linked as Greek. You end up with this kind of open marketplace of ideas and where people come together from all the city-states and they discuss things and people conduct business, and it becomes known as a forum where people would come together from all these other places. At least that's what the Romans called it. And society develops in that way. Now, eventually, this gives way to kind of aristocrats, the leaders of society, kind of having this heredity of leadership to some extent. Not kingship, but definitely like societal leadership in the democratic form. And these guys end up being the ones who hold all the political offices, and I think that it's actually kind of true here as well. the elders are called archons, and basically, they're a council that gives advice to political players all around, and they're still voting, and people are electing these people, but commoners don't really have much power. It really becomes that upper echelon of society in that early stage of democracy. But it's important here that you have people like presidents, essentially, that are setting agendas and meetings and discussions, and then decisions are being made by the group. Even if it's not the whole city or everyone voting just yet, it's way more democratic than, say, Pharaoh, right? Pretty obviously. It leads to a strong sense of community, out of which will develop, the civic virtue, and you end up with these models of, being part of the community and the right to place the community above one's own selfish desires. And it's pretty much unparalleled anywhere else at the time. So Egypt has been doing this kind of with Ma'at, but now Egypt's in decline. They're not really using that kind of system, but it's nothing compared to what the Greeks do. All Greek citizens are equal before the law, and that's really important as well, which is another break. If you look at Hammurabi's code, right, there was class divisions in the law. If one man strikes a man and they're both slaves, here's this punishment. But if a slave strikes a noble, his punishment is worse, right? The Greeks don't do that. They make everybody equal. And then civic virtue, which is basically like patriotism, right? The idea of, you have to be a good Athenian, that you be proud of where you live, and you're willing to go to war for that idea. And so you end up with this kind of point of comparison between some of the other societies and how the Greeks really make this their own. And the Greek legacy is absolutely enormous. It's probably the biggest legacy in Greece and Rome as well, which we'll talk about later, of course. Now, there is a seedy underbelly to this beautiful, society, and the images are incredible, as the cities they create are just as incredible. Male citizens do really have all the power. Kind of be remiss if I don't mention that the end with, the issue with gender and males being the only ones voting, and social groups in Greek society, we call it democracy, but women and children and slaves, laborers, foreigners, they don't really get a vote. So when we talk about open democracy, and we credit that to the Greeks, their assemblies are really the idea of voting, but you have to kind of put a little asterisks on it, because it's not everybody voting, right? It's kind of like Barry Bonds' home run record. You kind of have to put an asterisk on it for steroid use, but we call this democracy, but it's not really democracy. If half the population can't vote. And then it's even more than half, because you add up the slaves and foreign people and laborers, and the lowest classes, they don't get to vote. So really, 90% of the population doesn't get to vote, but it's far more democratic than anywhere else, right? Policies, they would vote on everything. So, specific festivals or celebrations on certain dates that, you could vote on that, and they kind of give you this unique identity as part of the group and part of pushing society forward. This is kind of a temple here that you can kind of see. It's pretty simple. It comes together that the gods were, there were female gods. So obviously, even though it's extremely patriarchal, they do honor the idea that women are not useless, like the Assyrians kind of said, but it's very, very different. Women do play, kind of have a role in Greek society. You have the Parthenon and stuff like this, all built to the goddess Athena. And so, it's really, practically speaking, socially, historians say that women were not invaluable by any means. Like, the Greeks didn't see them just as this major part of society, but they did put a much larger emphasis on women than some of the other Mesopotamian cultures did. You could argue that without women, their society probably would have crumbled, because women did a lot of the work around, domestic labor and farming and trading, and a lot of these things were done by women. And so the fact that they were kind of put on the back burner in terms of political rights, it kind of, the Greeks were kind of cutting off their nose despite their face to some extent. It's also during this era that the Greeks begin to kind of show up with the Olympic Games, which is kind of an obviously kind of thing that we're kind of used to seeing and knowing about. They would combine it with religious festivals and competition, and then obviously they would remove the religious festival part today. But they start the Olympics in like 776, and this ends ended 776, and then they ended in like 393. So. AD. So you have about 1,000 years where the Olympics are really, really, a big part of culture. And so it's really kind of interesting to see how the games would play out for the Greeks, right? During the Olympics, they would suspend wars. You could travel safely to get there, even if you were at war. And they were dedicated to Zeus, and very interesting, the idea of the Olympics today versus then, but there's no medals or prizes or anything like that. If you got defeated, you're defeated. There's no silver or bronze, there's no participation trophies for sure in the Olympics, but it really showed that the Greeks placed a high idea on the idea of virtue, a high value on the idea of virtue, of being successful at things. And that society would put all their differences aside to see who had the most virtue through competition. Now, despite all of these wonderful achievements of the Greek, we do need to note that they were also mired in disunity and conflict. The biggest one will come a few hundred years into the classical era between Athens and Sparta. But just I wanted to introduce you to the fact that there's constant disunity at this point. And specific wars that we're going to hit later on kind of show this, that it does slow the process of progress for the Greeks, outside of, the fact that everything else that they were doing was extremely progressive. But war really did tear them apart in a lot of ways. Now, the last part for this lecture, the Greeks renewed their interest in colonies, not just in Ionia, but all over the Mediterranean. You can look all the way to Spain, southern France, Italy. They influenced the Romans eventually, all around the Black Sea. And so these colonies, of course, show that the Greeks have recovered from what was ever going on in the so-called Dark Age. Because if you're setting out colonies, that means you have wealth to back them up and a desire to increase wealth. It's like an investment. When the Europeans colonized the Americas, it was an investment. So the Greek merchants eagerly go and trade with everyone, just like they did before the Dark Ages. That includes Egypt, Europe, Babylon, everywhere. And we see these colonies throughout the region, on the coast, for obvious reasons, because they're a seafaring civilization. But I think the most interesting thing about all of this is that when Caesar conquers Gaul, which is in France, Caesar's campaigning up there. It's about 700 years later, and he's like, hey, they're writing in this alphabet that looks like Greek, because they had learned it from Greek colonies way down here. Okay? So Gaul is using Greek alphabet and Greek architecture in northern France. And that's nowhere near Greece. And so the Greek civilization really does have a far reach. Their impact is very, very, very evident by looking around Europe, even much later on, several hundred years later, all the way up into Eastern Europe, Africa, Northern Africa, Asia. The Greeks make a huge, huge impact, and that's even before Alexander takes their culture and spreads it around the world. So that wraps this up for this lecture. In the next two sections, we're going to talk about Greek philosophy and its impacts. Thank you.